We are spiritual beings living in human bodies. Think of it this way. We live between two worlds. One is the spiritual, which is unchanging, and the other is the physical, where everything is always changing. As human beings, we are always moving between these two worlds. Screwtape writes, humans are amphibians, half spirit and half animal. As spirits, they belong to the eternal world, but as animals, they inhabit time. This means that while their spirit can be directed towards an eternal object, their bodies, passions, and imaginations are in constant change. To be in time means to change. Their nearest approach to constancy, therefore, is undulation, the repeated return to a level from which they repeatedly fall, a series of troughs and peaks. This description helps us understand our daily reality. We are constantly oscillating between what is eternal, our spirit, and what is temporary, our desires and emotions. And 2 Corinthians 4:18 warns us, so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Screwtape points out that, as humans, we are always changing, living a journey of highs and lows, a sequence of moments of spiritual clarity and times of confusion. Have you ever noticed how one day you can feel spiritually strong, but soon after you are pulled down by the worries of the day? This is our struggle. We are constantly trying to balance the spiritual and the physical, seeking constancy in the midst of change. The true journey is learning to focus on what is eternal, even when we are caught in the waves of emotions and desires. It's like a spiritual roller coaster, a cycle of highs and lows that we all face on our walk towards the divine.
Master? Master, you said you were going to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem they would kill you. If that's true, then it's our duty to keep you from going. You must not allow it to happen. Peter. You're thinking as men think, not as God thinks. The devil is speaking through you. Get thee behind me, Satan.
For we live by faith, not by sight. Often we may be tempted to confuse faith with how we feel, but this can lead us away from the true meaning of faith. Screwtape shows us that the enemy tries to distract us by making us focus on our feelings instead of concentrating on God. Screwtape writes, whenever they, the humans, are directing their attention towards the enemy God, we are defeated. But there are ways to prevent them from doing so. The simplest is to turn their gaze away from him towards themselves. Keep them watching their own minds and trying to produce feelings by the action of their own wills. When they meant to ask for charity, let them instead try to manufacture charitable feelings for themselves and not realize that this is what they are doing. When they meant to pray for courage, let them really be trying to feel brave. When they say they are praying for forgiveness, let them be trying to feel forgiven. Teach them to estimate the value of each prayer by their success in producing the desired feeling. Screwtape reveals a common trap, the temptation to measure our faith based on how we feel. He advises his tempters to make humans focus on their emotions instead of on God. It's easy to confuse faith with what we're feeling in the moment, thinking that prayers are only valid when we can feel something specific. Have you ever found yourself praying for courage, but deep down, trying to force the feeling of being brave? Or asking for forgiveness, but thinking you weren't forgiven because you didn't feel it? This is exactly what Screwtape wants, for you to think that faith depends on feelings. But true faith goes beyond emotions. It's not about how we feel, but about our trust in God, even when we feel nothing. Living by faith is focusing on God, even on days when we aren't inspired or emotional. Our faith should not waver according to our feelings, but should be anchored in the certainty that God is with us, no matter how we feel.
I think it's pretty common in Catholic circles, and I'm sure you've experienced this as a priest and a spiritual director, to hear people say, "Oh, I'm going through a
I know.
dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
I'm having a tough time," or, I'm sad. I'm maybe borderline depressed. I'm
Right.
confused. I'm anxious. How do we distinguish this very specific concept of the dark night of the soul of John of the Cross from just general sadness, depression, anxiety, confusion?
Right. They're different. They're not the same thing at all. Now, here's the point of contact. There was a point where we could see a connection. Namely, if I am attached through my senses and through my mind to the things of this world, and I want to get detached, well, that can be painful, right? It's not easy. I'm so ordered to this world, so closing my eyes and getting focused on a reality beyond, or saying I'm going to get detached from sensual pleasure or from money or power. Yeah, that's hard. It's a challenge, but that's not the same as depression or like psychological anxiety. Here's another distinction, Brandon, which I think is really interesting. Juan de la Cruz talks about the active night of the senses, the active night of the soul, and the passive night of the senses and of the soul. What's the difference? Well, in the first one, I'm kind of in charge. I say, okay, I am too attached. So I'm now going to get detached from whatever. I'm going to abstain. I'm going to fast. I'm going to close my eyes. Good. That's something that I'm able to do. But he says, and I think he's dead right about this. Anyone that's lived the spiritual life knows that's never going to be enough, because we have such a tendency to stay within the confines of our ordinary experience. So what does God have to do? God's got to take the initiative now and take away from us things that we do not want to be separated from. Now, there's suffering if you want. Yeah, absolutely. So this is very, to me, Brandon, really interesting. So someone's going through their life and suddenly something that they loved, and it was good in itself, and it's not sinful, let's say, but something they loved was taken away from them. Some dream they had, now I realize that's not going to happen. Some relationship, and now it's been severed. And I'm suffering from that. I hate it. I'm objecting to it. But might I read it, not just in worldly terms, but now begin to read it theologically and spiritually? Maybe God is taking this away from me. Why? That I might find a greater detachment that will enable me to come to a higher and more intense relationship with Him. See, so like if you're doing spiritual direction with someone and they're going through a real struggle because they've lost something, it might be a fair question to ask. Okay, remember our friend Jean-Pierre de Caussade, right? Whatever happens is directly or indirectly God's will. Okay, how come it's God's will right now in your life that this be taken away from you? Maybe that's serving God's purpose of drawing you closer to Himself. Here's another thing that John of the Cross is really good at, Brandon. I used to use it a lot in spiritual direction with people. He said, typically, when someone's being drawn into friendship with God, God gives a lot of consolations. Now, you know what I think of? I've shared some of this autobiography before, but when I was a young guy and I discovered Thomas Aquinas, and then I started reading The Seven-Story Mountain of Thomas Merton, I remember that period of my life with great joy and great exuberance because I was experiencing a tremendous consolation. It was exciting to me. I remember the same time I was listening to the Beatles a lot. I was just kind of discovering them. I can hear a Beatles song to this day, and it reminds me vividly of that moment. And God was giving me, I would say, a lot of consolation to draw me into friendship with him, right? Well, John of the Cross says, fine, it often works that way. But almost invariably, what's God going to do? He's going to withdraw the consolation. Why? Because he's cruel? No. It's like weaning a child, right? You're not meant to fall in love with the consolation. You're meant to fall in love with God and God's will. And that might not be very consoling sometimes. It might be really challenging. Maximilian Kolbe, offering his life in exchange for this man. Was that consoling to him? On the contrary, because he learned long before not to fall in love with consolations, but to fall in love with God's will. And so John of the Cross will say that. God, now this is the passive night of the senses, the passive night of the soul, is he might take things away from us that we're not willing to let go of ourselves. Does that make sense? So it's not depression, not at all, but it can be a struggle for sure.
Fifth, fear is a liar. How do we know this? In 2 Timothy 1:7, it says, "For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline." Screwtape writes, "We want him to be in the maximum uncertainty, so that his mind will be filled with contradictory pictures of the future, every one of which arouses hope or fear. There is nothing like suspense and anxiety for barricading a human's mind against the enemy God. He wants men to be concerned with what they do. Our business is to keep them thinking about what will happen to them." What Screwtape is saying is that fear is a powerful tool to distract us from God. He wants us to be trapped thinking about the future, all the things that could go wrong. When we focus on the what if, we forget to live in the present and trust in God. Have you ever found yourself imagining the worst-case scenario and it paralyzed you? Fear traps us in a web of thoughts, preventing us from acting and trusting in God's plan. We become anxious and insecure, always expecting disaster. But God calls us to live differently, as it says in Isaiah 41:10-110. "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." He wants us to focus on the present, on the actions and choices we can make now, trusting that he is in control of the future. While fear tells us to worry about what could happen, God asks us to live with faith, believing in his promises. Fear may seem real, but it's a lie that pulls us away from the truth, that God is always by our side, guiding our steps. When we trust in him, we find the peace that fear tries to steal. To overcome fear, we need to focus on the present, do what is right today, and leave the future in God's hands. Seventh, faith is not a means to an end, but an end in itself. As it says in Hebrews 11:6, "And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." How many times have we found ourselves using our faith as a means to achieve something? Are we seeking God for who he is, or only for what he can give us? Screwtape writes, "When you make the world an end and faith a means, you have almost won your man, and it makes very little difference what kind of worldly end he is pursuing, provided that meetings, pamphlets, policies, movements, causes, and crusades matter more to him than prayers, sacraments, and charity. He is ours, and the more religious on those terms, the more securely ours." This observation leads us to reflect on a subtle but profound mistake that can infiltrate our spiritual journey, turning faith into a mere means to achieve goals. When we use it just to gain worldly success, it loses its deeper purpose, which is to connect us with God in an intimate and sincere relationship. Faith should not be a tool to achieve success in the world, but the very reason for our existence, a path towards the Creator. Imagine someone who goes to church every Sunday, participates in service groups, but does all of this only to be seen as a good person or to receive something in return. What is missing here? A true connection with God. In this case, faith becomes a means, not an end. This dangerous shift in focus, where the world becomes the final goal, and faith only a mechanism to achieve earthly goals, reflects a spiritual emptiness. It's not that external actions don't matter. They are important, but they must come from a heart rooted in prayer, sacraments, and genuine charity. Otherwise, even the noblest efforts can become empty campaigns driven by the ego, and in the end, they distance us from God rather than bringing us closer to him. Are we allowing meetings, causes, or movements to become more important than our communion with God? We must ask ourselves what lies at the center of our faith. True faith should bring us closer to God, not be used for our own interests. When we use it as a means to achieve temporal success, it loses its transformative power, the power that shapes us into the image of Christ and fills us with God's love and truth. So what is moving your faith today? Are you seeking God for what he can do for you, or simply because he is worthy of being sought? When we stop using faith as a bargaining chip, we discover something much greater, a peace and joy that come from seeking God for who he is, not for what he can give us. By recentering our lives on true faith, the fruits of this pursuit, acts of love, justice, and compassion, naturally emerge. They are not the goal, but the result of a soul in communion with the divine, a living testimony that living by faith transforms us and glorifies God in all things. Eighth, the devil is subtle and cunning. As 1 Peter 5:8 warns us, "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." Have you ever thought that evil could be right beside you without you even noticing? How the enemy can operate in the shadows, invisible to our eyes. Screwtape writes, "Our policy for the moment is to conceal ourselves. I do not think you will have much difficulty in keeping the patient in ignorance."
Master? Master, you said you were going to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem they would kill you.